For 7 years, Chester Bennington lived a double life that would have shocked even his closest friends. While the world knew him as the tortured voice of Lincoln Park, Chester was secretly working the graveyard shift at Los Angeles County's Crisis Intervention Center, taking calls from people contemplating suicide. Using the alias Chris Martinez, Chester Bennington spent thousands of hours talking strangers through their darkest moments, becoming one of the most effective crisis counselors in the center's history. What he did with his voice in those late-night conversations didn't just save individual lives. It revolutionized how crisis intervention is practiced across the country. This is the story of Chester's secret job, the lives he saved in the shadows, and why the revelation of his hidden career changes everything we thought we knew about his final years. When the truth finally came out, it didn't just surprise the music world. It transformed our understanding of what it means to turn pain into purpose. The story begins in 2010, during one of the darkest periods of Chester's life. Lincoln Park had just finished their A Thousand Suns tour, and Chester was struggling with depression, addiction, and the weight of being a voice for millions of people dealing with their own pain. But instead of self-destructing, Chester made a decision that would define the rest of his life. I was driving home from the studio one night, and I heard this radio PSA about suicide prevention. Chester later confided to Dr. Sarah Williams, the only therapist who knew about his secret job. The announcer said they needed volunteers for their crisis hotline, and something clicked. I realized I'd been talking people through suicidal thoughts my whole career through music, but I'd never tried to do it directly. Chester contacted the Los Angeles County Crisis Intervention Center the next day, but not as Chester Bennington. He created an elaborate backstory. Chris Martinez, a construction worker who'd struggled with depression and wanted to help others. He provided fake references, used a different address, and even altered his voice slightly to avoid recognition. The training was intense, recalled Linda Rodriguez, who was Chester's supervisor at the Crisis Center for 7 years without knowing his real identity. Chris Martinez was one of the most dedicated trainees we'd ever had. He absorbed everything: suicide assessment protocols, de-escalation techniques, active listening methods. But what made him special was that he brought something to the training that couldn't be taught: genuine empathy born from real experience. Chester threw himself into the 6-week training program with the same intensity he brought to his music. He studied psychology textbooks, practiced role-playing scenarios, and learned the technical aspects of crisis intervention. But his real education came from his own lived experience with suicidal thoughts, depression, and trauma. Chris had this way of connecting with callers that was unlike anything I'd seen in 20 years of crisis work. Linda continued. He could hear the pain behind what people weren't saying. He'd pick up on vocal cues that other counselors missed. It was like he had a sixth sense for human suffering. Chester's first shift was on a Thursday night in November 2010. He was assigned to the suicide prevention hotline, taking calls from people in immediate crisis. His training supervisor, Marcus Johnson, monitored his calls for the first month. I'll never forget Chris's first call. Marcus remembered. It was a teenager who'd taken a bottle of pills and was calling to say goodbye. Most new volunteers would have panicked or followed the script robotically, but Chris just started talking to her like she was his little sister. Within 10 minutes, she was telling him where she lived so we could send an ambulance. That first save was transformative for Chester. He realized that his years of channeling pain into music had given him tools that could be used directly to save lives in real-time crisis situations. After that first call, I was addicted, Chester told Dr. Williams. Not to the adrenaline, but to that moment when you hear someone's voice change from hopeless to maybe there's a reason to stick around. It was like performing the perfect song, but instead of applause, you got a human being choosing to live. Chester quickly became one of the center's most effective counselors. He worked 2 8-hour shifts per week, always the overnight shift from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. He chose those hours partly for anonymity, fewer staff members around to potentially recognize him, but also because the overnight hours were when people were most isolated with their thoughts. The calls that came in between midnight and 4 a.m. were the hardest ones, explained Dr. Michael Torres, the center's clinical director. That's when people have been alone with their pain all day, when the darkness feels infinite. We needed our strongest counselors on those shifts. Chester didn't just take calls. He revolutionized the center's approach to certain types of crisis intervention. He developed what supervisors called the Martinez Method, though they never knew it was actually the Bennington Method. Chris had this technique where he'd ask callers about music, Linda recalled. He'd say, "Tell me about a song that makes you feel something." And somehow, that question would open up conversations that traditional crisis protocols couldn't access. People would start talking about why certain lyrics mattered to them, and Chris would use that emotional connection to build reasons for living. What Linda and the other supervisors didn't realize was that Chester was using his deep understanding of how music affects people in crisis to create new therapeutic approaches. He understood that many people contemplating suicide felt disconnected from their emotions, and music could be a bridge back to feeling something worth living for. Chester's case files, reviewed years later, showed an extraordinary success rate. In 7 years of crisis work, he talked to over 3,000 people in immediate danger. His follow-up rate, the percentage of callers who stayed in contact with the Center for Ongoing Support, was nearly 90%, compared to the national average of about 60%. Chris had this way of making people feel like they weren't just another crisis call, explained Jenny Martinez, a social worker who often received referrals from Chester. He'd remember details about their lives, ask about their pets, their jobs, their dreams. He treated every person like someone he genuinely cared about, not just a problem to solve. But Chester's secret job was taking a toll that no one at the crisis center could see. While he was becoming an expert at talking other people through suicidal crises, his own mental health was deteriorating. The weight of absorbing so much human suffering, combined with his own ongoing struggles, was overwhelming. Chester was carrying emotional burdens for thousands of people, Dr. Williams observed. Every call he took, every life he saved, it added to the weight he was already carrying. He was like an emotional firefighter who never got to leave the burning building. Chester's family and friends noticed changes in him during this period, but they attributed them to the normal pressures of his music career. They didn't know that Chester was spending 16 hours a week listening to people's deepest pain and darkest thoughts. Chester would come home from these shifts emotionally drained. His ex-wife Talinda later recalled, after learning about his secret job, "I thought he was just having trouble sleeping or was stressed about work. I had no idea he'd been up all night preventing suicides." The secrecy was essential to Chester, but it also meant he had no support system for processing the secondary trauma he was experiencing. Crisis counselors are supposed to have supervision, debriefing sessions, and peer support to handle the emotional weight of the work. But Chester couldn't fully participate in these support systems without risking his identity being discovered. "Chris was always professional during our debriefing sessions," Linda recalled. "But looking back, I can see that he was holding back. He'd give us the technical details about his calls, but he wouldn't talk about the emotional impact on him. I wish I'd pushed harder, but he seemed so competent that we didn't realize he needed more support." Chester's secret job also influenced his music in ways that fans and even his bandmates didn't understand at the time. Songs from Linkin Park's later albums contained references to crisis intervention, mental health recovery, and the specific language used in suicide prevention. Chester started using phrases in his lyrics that sounded like crisis counseling techniques, observed Mike Shinoda years later. Lines about staying on the line, not hanging up, finding reasons to hold on. "We thought he was just evolving as a songwriter, but now I realize he was processing his crisis work through music." One of Chester's most profound cases came in 2014, when he received a call from a military veteran named David who was planning to end his life that night. David had PTSD from 3 tours in Afghanistan and felt like he was a burden to his family. Chris spent 4 hours on the phone with David, Marcus Johnson remembered. Most crisis calls last 20 to 30 minutes, but Chris stayed with David through his entire plan to die and helped him create a new plan to live. By the end of the call, David had agreed to check himself into a VA hospital. But Chester's intervention with David went far beyond that initial call. Over the following weeks, Chester arranged his crisis center shifts to coincide with David's most difficult hours. He learned David's triggers, the sound of helicopters, crowded spaces, sudden loud noises, and developed specific coping strategies for each one. Chris taught David a technique he called musical grounding, Marcus recalled. When David felt a panic attack coming on, Chris would have him identify 5 songs that made him feel safe, then focus on the lyrics until the anxiety passed. It was brilliant because it gave David's mind something specific to do instead of spiraling into trauma memories. What made this case special wasn't just that Chester saved David's life, but what happened afterward. David became a regular caller to the center, but he would only talk to Chris. Over the next 3 years, Chester became David's primary support person, talking him through PTSD episodes, relationship problems, and career challenges. David never knew he was getting counseling from a famous rock star, Linda explained. To him, Chris was just this construction worker who understood trauma and cared enough to be available whenever David was struggling. That authenticity was crucial to David's recovery. Chester's work with David became a case study that the center used to train other counselors. Without revealing Chris's real identity, supervisors would share techniques Chester had developed and the remarkable recovery David had achieved through their ongoing relationship. Another significant case involved a 17-year-old named Sarah who called the crisis line after being sexually assaulted. Sarah had taken a bottle of sleeping pills and called to say goodbye to someone, anyone, before she died. Chris was scheduled to go home, but he heard Sarah's intake call and volunteered to take it. Linda remembered. He stayed 3 hours past his shift end, and by the time they finished talking, Sarah had agreed to go to the emergency room. But Chester didn't stop there. He arranged for Sarah to be connected with specialized counselors, helped coordinate her medical care, and maintained contact with her throughout her recovery process. He even discreetly arranged for her therapy to be funded through an anonymous source, his own money, though no one at the center knew this. Sarah would call the crisis line asking specifically for Chris whenever she was struggling with PTSD symptoms from her assault, explained Dr. Torres. Chris developed a whole protocol for helping sexual assault survivors that we've since adopted as standard practice. His understanding of trauma was so sophisticated that we started recommending his techniques to other crisis centers. What the center staff didn't realize was that Chester's techniques came from his own experience as a childhood sexual abuse survivor. Every time he helped someone like Sarah process their trauma, he was also processing his own in ways that traditional therapy hadn't been able to accomplish. Chester's case file showed that he had particular success with certain types of callers, childhood abuse survivors, people dealing with addiction, individuals struggling with depression, and those who felt like burdens to their families. These were all issues Chester had personal experience with, which gave him an intuitive understanding of the caller's mental state. Chris had this way of knowing exactly what questions to ask, Marcus observed. He could hear something in a caller's voice that would tell him whether they were dealing with trauma, addiction, relationship issues, or financial stress. He'd adjust his entire approach based on those vocal cues. One of Chester's most challenging cases came in 2015, when he received a call from a mother named Jennifer who was planning to kill herself and her 2 young children. Jennifer believed she was protecting her children from a life of poverty and suffering. That call lasted 6 hours, Linda recalled. Chris talked Jennifer through her entire plan, helped her understand that her children's lives had value independent of their circumstances, and ultimately convinced her to take her kids to a family shelter instead of carrying out her plan. Chester's approach with Jennifer was unlike anything the center had seen before. Instead of focusing on the danger to the children, Chester focused on Jennifer's love for them and helped her see that love as a reason to find alternatives to suicide. Chris told Jennifer that her children would rather be poor with their mother than rich without her, Marcus shared. He helped her understand that the pain she was trying to end for them wasn't worth the permanent trauma of losing their mother. It was incredibly sophisticated psychological work. Chester stayed in contact with Jennifer's case for over a year, helping coordinate social services, job training, and housing assistance. Jennifer and her children eventually found stability, and she became an advocate for other single mothers in crisis. But Chester's extraordinary success rate came at a personal cost no one could see. He was absorbing trauma from thousands while dealing with his own increasing depression. Chester was like an emotional sponge, Dr. Williams observed. Every call he took added to the weight he was already carrying. He was saving others while slowly losing himself. Chester's secret became harder to maintain as his voice became more recognizable. He had several close calls where callers recognized him despite disguising his voice. There were times when callers asked Chris if he was Chester Bennington, Marcus recalled. Chris handled it well. He'd joke about getting that a lot, or redirect to the caller's needs. but it stressed him out. The stress of maintaining his secret identity, combined with the emotional toll and his own mental health struggles, was overwhelming. In 2017, Chester considered revealing his identity or stepping back from crisis work. Chester was torn, Dr. Williams explained. He knew the work affected his mental health, but he felt uniquely qualified to help people with similar struggles. He felt responsible for those who depended on Chris. Chester's final shift was July 15, 2017, 5 days before his death. He worked 8 hours, taking 12 calls and successfully talking 2 people through immediate suicidal crises. Chester's relationship with David became a template for how he approached many of his repeat callers. Instead of maintaining professional distance, Chester developed genuine friendships with people who needed ongoing support. He memorized their stories, remembered their birthdays, and checked in on them during his shifts. Chris violated a lot of traditional crisis counseling boundaries, Dr. Torres admitted. We're supposed to maintain professional distance, not get personally involved. But Chris's approach worked so well that we started revising our protocols. His success rate was so high that we had to acknowledge that his methods, while unconventional, were incredibly effective. Chester's influence on crisis intervention practices extended beyond just his individual success with callers. He developed training materials, wrote policy recommendations, and mentored new volunteers, all under the identity of Chris Martinez, construction worker and part-time crisis counselor. Chris wrote a training manual about using creative arts and crisis intervention, Linda revealed. He had these techniques for helping people express their feelings through drawing, music, writing. The manual became required reading for all our volunteers, and it's still used in crisis centers across the country. By 2016, Chester had become a legend within the Los Angeles crisis intervention community. Chris Martinez was the counselor that other counselors wanted to learn from, the one who could handle the most difficult cases, the one who seemed to have a magical ability to connect with people in crisis. But Chester's secret was becoming harder to maintain. His voice, despite his efforts to disguise it, was occasionally recognized by callers who were Lincoln Park fans. Each close call increased Chester's anxiety about being discovered. There were a few times when callers asked Chris if he was Chester Bennington, Marcus recalled. Chris always handled it well. He'd joke about getting that a lot because of his voice, or he'd redirect the conversation back to the caller's needs. But you could tell it stressed him out. The stress of maintaining his secret identity, combined with the emotional toll of crisis work and his own mental health struggles, was becoming overwhelming. In early 2017, Chester began talking to Dr. Williams about whether he should reveal his identity or step back from crisis work entirely. Chester was torn, Dr. Williams explained. He knew the work was affecting his own mental health, but he also knew he was uniquely qualified to help people who were struggling with the same issues he faced. He felt responsible for the people who'd come to depend on Chris for support. Chester's final shift at the crisis center was on July 15, 2017, 5 days before his death. He worked a full 8-hour shift, taking 12 calls and successfully talking 2 people through immediate suicidal crises. Chris seemed different that last night, Linda remembered. More focused, more intense. He took detailed notes on every call, made sure all his cases were properly documented for follow-up. Looking back, it feels like he was making sure everything was in order. During his final shift, Chester had a conversation with Marcus Johnson that would later seem prophetic. Chris told me that crisis work had taught him that everyone has a breaking point, Marcus recalled. He said the difference between people who survive and people who don't isn't strength or weakness. It's having someone who cares enough to stay on the line during the worst moments. When news of Chester Bennington's death broke on July 20, 2017, the staff at the Los Angeles County Crisis Intervention Center was devastated like everyone else. They mourned Chester as fans, having no idea that they'd lost a colleague. It wasn't until 3 months later that Chester's secret was discovered. Dr. Williams, settling Chester's estate, found documentation related to his crisis center work. The revelation shocked everyone who had known Chris Martinez. I couldn't believe it, Linda said when she learned the truth. This man I'd worked with for 7 years, who I'd watched save hundreds of lives, was Chester Bennington. Suddenly, everything made sense. His intuitive understanding of pain, his ability to connect with people through music, his dedication to the work despite having what I assumed was a demanding construction schedule. The Crisis Center held a memorial service for Chris Martinez that was attended by dozens of people whose lives he'd saved. Many of them still didn't know his real identity, but they wanted to honor the man who had talked them through their darkest hours. David, the veteran Chris had helped for 3 years, spoke at the memorial. Marcus shared. He said that Chris had given him something to live for when he'd lost all hope. He said Chris had saved not just his life, but his family's lives too, because his suicide would have destroyed them. The revelation of Chester's secret job has transformed crisis intervention practices nationwide. The techniques he developed are now taught in training programs across the country. His approach to using creative arts in crisis counseling has been adopted by hundreds of crisis centers. Chester Bennington revolutionized crisis intervention, Dr. Torres explained. His methods, developed under the identity of Chris Martinez, are now standard practice. He proved that people who've survived their own crises can be the most effective at helping others survive theirs. The Los Angeles County Crisis Intervention Center has established the Chris Martinez Excellence in Crisis Counseling Award, given annually to the volunteer who best embodies Chester's approach to helping people in crisis. Recipients are trained in Chester's techniques and carry forward his legacy of turning personal pain into life-saving service. Chester's secret job wasn't just about helping individual callers, Linda reflected. He was studying human resilience, learning what makes people choose life over death, and developing methods that could help other counselors be more effective. He turned the Crisis Center into his laboratory for understanding how to heal human suffering. Today, the techniques Chester developed as Chris Martinez are used in crisis centers, hospitals, and therapy practices around the world. His training materials have been translated into multiple languages, and his approach to crisis intervention is taught in psychology programs at major universities. Chester Bennington saved lives in 2 ways, Dr. Williams concluded. Through his music, he helped millions of people feel less alone in their pain. Through his secret job as Chris Martinez, he directly intervened in thousands of crisis situations. But perhaps his greatest legacy is proving that our deepest wounds can become our most powerful tools for healing others. The people Chester helped during his 7 years of crisis work continue to thrive. David, the veteran, has become a peer counselor himself, using techniques Chester taught him to help other veterans with PTSD. Many of Chester's former callers have gone on to become crisis counselors, teachers, and advocates, carrying forward the lessons they learned during their darkest moments. Chester showed us that rock stars aren't just entertainers, Marcus reflected. They can be healers, counselors, lifesavers. He used his platform not just to perform, but to serve. His secret job proved that fame and fortune mean nothing if you're not using them to help people who are suffering. In the end, Chester Bennington's secret job revealed the truth about who he really was beneath the celebrity persona. Not just a troubled artist struggling with his own demons, but a dedicated healer who turned his personal battles into professional skills that saved thousands of lives. The Crisis Intervention Center where Chester worked as Chris Martinez now receives calls from people who've heard his story and want to volunteer their own time to help others in crisis. Chester's secret job has inspired a new generation of crisis counselors who understand that the best healers are often those who've been broken themselves and found ways to piece their lives back together. Sometimes the most important work we do is the work nobody knows about. Chester Bennington proved that true heroism happens not on stage in front of thousands, but in quiet moments with strangers who need someone to remind them that their lives have value, that their pain is temporary, and that someone, even someone they've never met, cares enough to stay on the line until they're safe.